Greetings, I'm Tanisha Baker, and I come to you as a believer. This presentation will be faith-led, but not faith-limited. I come to you in love and through grace. I appreciate the opportunity to engage with you as we tackle sensitive topics that most likely will pull us out of our comfort zones, but understand that with discomfort comes dissatisfaction, and with that, the desire for change. This is the first of a three-part series that will address the roots and reality of racism, privilege, and perceptions, and will conclude with perhaps the most meaningful part, which will move us from reactions to the reality of racism to action. Reaction to action. As we start our deep dive into these topics, we go forward, knowing that this conversation may be messy, but it will be meaningful. The reality of racism is painful, yet it's pertinent. It can even be nasty, but it is surely necessary. As I mentioned, there may be times when you feel uncomfortable, but don't let that discomfort give you an excuse to disengage. Allow yourself to be vulnerable in your own space. As difficult as it is to hear it, imagine what it's like to live it. We don't have enough time in this series to peel back all the layers of racism. all the history, all the movements, all the ingredients. So I'm going to share some suggestions along the way to help facilitate your ownership and understanding of racism and hopefully create a path for your active participation in knocking down the walls of racism. The roots and reality of racism. Now, the history of black people, regardless of what our history books say, didn't begin with slavery. Centuries ago, forced labor was not uncommon. Africans and Europeans had been trading goods and people for centuries. I encourage you to learn more about the continent of Africa before European intervention. Africa was credited for many scientific developments: engineering, mathematics, architecture, and medicine. Many historians will share that the earliest evidence of human existence was found in Africa. There were structures for government and trading, and I share this because regardless of those accomplishments, regardless of that evidence, there grew a belief that Negroes, people of color, were naturally inferior to whites. The idea that one race is inferior to another is the core of racism. And so, the roots of racism take hold as enslavement starts to be based on race. Slaves came to this country with nothing but memories of freedom and their faith. Generations were born into bondage and shackled to a system that was all they knew. Yet, this notion of freedom is powerful, it's inherent. You need to read about a slave named Elizabeth Freeman. She actually filed a lawsuit for her freedom after the Revolutionary War. And while her story is interesting, what I want to share is a quote from her. She said, "If 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told at the end of that minute that I would die, I would have taken it." The roots of racism have been tended and watered and fed so much that it lives in the soul of this country. It's lived here for hundreds of years, restraining one's potential, taking away rights and freedoms, subjecting humans to inhumane conditions. Brutality and death should feel wrong in our hearts. We, and by we I mean all of us, regardless of wealth, color, or creed, are meant to work together in the fight for what's right. There's a natural function of our hearts that isn't dependent on color. The spirit of truth and humanity and kindness is colorblind. White people, black people, we have a history of working together to fight injustice, to fight what's wrong. The protests we're seeing all over the world with various races coming together isn't really new. The first formal protests against slavery were by the Quakers. And then think about the Underground Railroad, which was dependent on a trail of safe houses and hideouts. Black people couldn't own property, so these safe houses and hideouts were in the homes of white people. And when I look at historic photos of marches and protests, I see white and brown and black faces together. When I look at the media coverage now, I see white and black and brown faces together. A blended call for change and reform. But this can't be a fad or a trend or a way to ease guilt. It's admirable to stand next to me, but try to imagine standing in my shoes. So there has to be continuing conversations and open lines of communication. We have to build bridges of understanding, and we have to acknowledge each other's truths. You can't be a part of the change if you ignore there's a problem. For those participating in this series, you are taking a step toward a solution built on understanding. You're demonstrating a willingness. We don't have all the answers, but we are together saying we're going to try. We are together saying we want this to be better. African Americans have been living in burning buildings for many years, choking on the smoke as the flames burn closer and closer. Racism in America is like dust in the air. It seems invisible, even if you're choking on it, until you let the sun in. Then you see it's everywhere. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Can you define racism? Can you recognize it? What does racism look like? What does it sound like? Take a moment and reflect on your ideas around racism. Your first assignment is to explore a historic event that was a direct result of racism in this country. So one example would be the massacre and destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Or you may decide to learn more about Medgar Evers. This learning will not be pleasant, but it will help develop an understanding around the experiences endured by people of color. This will put you on a road to empathy. Then, I want you to write as many words as you can related to racism. Following that, for this next week, intentionally identify evidence of racism or racial disparities that you witness in your day-to-day. Sometimes racism can be subtle and you may not easily recognize it if you don't live it. It is possible to ignore it. That's why I'm asking you to do the exercise of looking for it. For me, racism looks like being followed around the store without offering of assistance. It looks like the pain in the eyes of Black and brown citizens and tear-stained cheeks as we continue to witness the killing and the brutality of men and women of color. Racism feels like the crippling fear I have over the safety of my son and husband every day. Every day. It feels like exhaustion. Can you imagine being suppressed and oppressed as a way of life? Racism is my resume being pushed to the side because my name is Tanisha. It's somebody holding their purse a little tighter and crossing the street when they see a young Black man. Sounds like the talk I have to have with my Black son. You know, the talk about interactions and behaviors that will help him make it home. As you have conversations about goals for your children and making plans for their futures, do you include strategies on how to make it home alive? Racism sounds like a dying man calling for his mama and saying, "I can't breathe." It sounds like sadness and anger and protest and weeping. And racism also sounds like silence. We're going to talk more about that when we move towards solutions, but there comes a time when silence is betrayal. Racism creates adverse conditions for people of color. Racism diminishes the ability to reach one's full potential. Racism is a barrier to equality, equity, fairness, and justice. Racism creates the disparities. There are disparities in education, economic wealth, health, disparities in home ownership, incarceration, and access to experiences and opportunities. Now, there are zip codes here in the city of Knoxville that have a median income of over $100,000. There are other zip codes with a median income of under $20,000. Now get this, the higher the income, the less the diversity. The less the diversity, the increase in longevity. The less diversity, the higher the educational attainment. So I'm looking at this lifespan chart based on zip codes, and I noticed there's about a 10-year difference in my zip code and another one. So you think, why don't you move? But it's not that easy. Black Americans make up about 13% of the population but have less than 3% of the country's wealth. Black unemployment is always twice as high as white unemployment. You are twice as likely to get a call back for a job interview if you have a white sounding name. Racial disparities are propelled by systemic racism. This term has received a lot of attention lately, especially since the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Ahmaud Arbery. Systemic racism is also referred to as institutional racism. It is the racism that can be found in the systems and functions of society. It is racism that exists through policies, practice, and procedures that give permission for racism to influence the acquisition of wealth, fairness in our criminal justice system, employment, education, housing, healthcare, and political power. Racism itself is a system in which one group of people exercise power over another group. If we were in the same space, because I'm a teacher, we'd have a word wall and we would explore these terms that are often associated with racism. But that's your next assignment. Take time to define the terms and give yourself the vocabulary to have conversations on race. When you join us again, we're going to continue our conversation on race and privilege and move toward a solution. So I leave you now in love and the desire for peace.